Good afternoon and welcome to our, what are we on, sixth? Oh my goodness, sixth senior thesis defense. Please welcome Mr. Alex Guerrero to the front.
What is virtue? According to Aristotle, virtue is the mean between two excesses. It is through virtue that humans can live a good life. Aristotle states that happiness is the telos, or purpose of man. He also states that virtue is the only way to lead to happiness. Society, however, only focuses individuals towards universal virtue. An example of universal virtue is the virtue soldiers demonstrate when they fight for their country. This virtue is known most commonly as piety, loyalty to one's country. Universal virtue is necessary, but individual virtue is also necessary. There must be a perfect balance between the two. Søren Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher who lived in the mid-19th century. During his time, Hegelian philosophy was very prominent amongst philosophers. And in a broad view, Hegelian philosophy focuses the individual on the universal. The individual is quite literally the individual, the singular human being. And the universal is the state. Kierkegaard went directly at odds with Hegelian philosophy. Kierkegaard's work, Fear and Trembling, delves into the story of Abraham and Isaac. Kierkegaard developed three worlds in his philosophy within the book Fear and Trembling. There's the aesthetic world, the ethical, and the religious. Universal virtue has to deal with the ethical world, and individual virtue takes a leap from the ethical world to the religious world. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard looks at common examples in mythology and biblical examples. One mythological example is the story of Agamemnon. Agamemnon was the commander of the Greek army during the Trojan War. But on his way to Troy with the Greek army, Agamemnon killed a deer. But this deer was no ordinary deer. This deer was a sacred deer to Artemis. Now, y'all may think that, oh, it's just a harmless deer, nothing's going to happen. Well, Artemis brought upon wrath to the Greek army. She did not allow any of the Greeks to be able to sail to Troy. Now, what would you do in Agamemnon's shoes? Before this, Paris went to Sparta, stole his brother Menelaus' wife, Helen, and sailed back to Troy. Now, your family's name is at risk. You literally lost all glory in your family name. And now you also have to represent your nation and lead them to war. What will you do? Well, what Artemis asked Agamemnon to do was to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. Now, this is very difficult because now he's balancing his obligation as leader of the Greek army with his obligation as a father to protect his daughter. Agamemnon, he later ends up sacrificing his daughter because he views his obligation to the Greek army as greater than the obligation he has as a father. Kierkegaard states that the tragic hero still remains within the ethical. He lets one expression of the ethical find its telos in a higher expression of the ethical. This is exactly what Agamemnon did. His ethical world being Iphigenia, he submitted that under his ethical obligation as leader of the Greek army. And in doing so, he led the Greeks to win the Trojan War. This may seem very difficult, and it may seem like mythology because that's what it is. But there is a biblical example as well of this. Jephthah was a person in the Bible that most exemplified this as well. Jephthah was a nobody who lived in the land of Gilead. He was asked by the elders of Gilead to fight the Ammonites who were pillaging their land. Now, before Jephthah goes to battle and leads the Gileadians to victory, he prays to God, saying, "If you will indeed deliver the people of Ammon into my hands, then it will be that whatever comes out the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the people of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering." Jephthah was willing to sacrifice whatever he was willing to sacrifice any personal possession so that the Gileadians would be victorious. We fast forward in the story. He defeats the Ammonites, and when he returns home, something incredibly disturbing happens. His daughter is the first one to come out and meet him. Now, this is very sad because this is an instance of a father who promised something to God, and now he has to put his daughter's life, he has to sacrifice her so that he can fulfill his promise to God. Now, Jephthah, we go later on in the story, he does end up sacrificing his daughter to God. But this is also because he's a tragic hero. He sacrificed one ethical expression under another so that he was able to fulfill his promise. Now, these are all sad stories of two fathers sacrificing their children. But there is yet another, and this is the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham was a man who was known as the father of faith. In Genesis chapter 11, that's the story of Abraham and Isaac, where God calls Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. Now, to put into context, Abraham waited 25 years from the moment God told him he was going to have a son to Isaac actually being born. He waited on this promise for 25 years that he would have a son. And now God is asking him to sacrifice his son. Now, this may be disturbing as well, but there's another element to this. God also promised Abraham that he was going to be the father of many nations. And this was only going to be, the only way that this promise could be fulfilled was through Isaac, because he was the only son, the only legitimate son to Abraham. Now, Soren Kierkegaard states that in Abraham's life there is no higher expression for the ethical than this, that the father shall love his son. So, is he truly loving Isaac by sacrificing him? Well, here Abraham applied individual virtue. Here, Abraham was willing to fulfill what God was calling him to do, yet he still believed fully that God was going to do exactly what he had promised. Now, I used this virtue, the virtue of faith, earlier on. I said this. This is an example of individual virtue. Now, Kierkegaard states that faith is precisely this paradox, that the individual as a particular is higher than the universal, and is justified over against it, and is not subordinate but superior to the universal. Now here, Abraham was making a leap from the ethical world to the religious, where many things seem paradoxical. Here, the individual becomes higher than the universal. Now, there seems to be many questions on why would Abraham do this, and that is because he loved God. His love for God trumped everything else. So, Abraham is considered the father of faith just because he applied faith to this situation. But this is not the only example of why he was seen as the father of faith. He applied faith to many other instances. And he is also known as a virtuous man because he balanced universal virtue with individual virtue. Now, some may say, wait, these examples, they're all of extremes. Fathers having to sacrifice their children. How can we even apply this to our daily lives? Well, it is through these extreme situations that we can see what is clearly good and what is bad. It is very clear cut, it's cookie cut. And since we are able to easily distinguish between these two, we are able to understand the true moral of the story. And this is how we apply it to daily lives, because we are able to see an easy example of why this is, then we are able to apply it to the most difficult examples. The whole premise of this speech is that one needs to balance individual virtue with universal virtue. Agamemnon applied universal virtue when it may have seemed imprudent to do so, and so did Jephthah. But Abraham, he applied individual virtue at the moment that it was precisely needed. Abraham used moderation and prudence to truly be virtuous. And now I challenge you, will you take upon the teachings of this school, and will you live a virtuous life, balancing both individual and universal virtue? Or will you continue down the road and not live a virtuous life? Thank you.